She gets nothing, you make sure of that, not one damn dollar. Ethan Carter said it loud enough for Emily to hear, loud enough for the bailiff to shift uncomfortably, loud enough for the judge to glance up from his papers. He wasn't talking to his attorney anymore. He was performing. 7 years of marriage, and he wanted an audience for the ending. When the gavel came down in his favor, he laughed, openly, threw his head back and laughed at the woman sitting 3 feet away with her hands folded and her eyes dry. He had taken everything. The house, the accounts, the future, and he thought he had won. Then the old man in the back row stood up. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning of the divorce hearing, Ethan Carter woke up feeling invincible. He had slept 8 full hours, which was unusual for him. He was normally a man who chased sleep the way he chased everything else in his life, desperately, impatiently, and with the quiet suspicion that he deserved more than he was getting. But that Tuesday morning in Dallas, Texas, he slept like a man without a single thing weighing on his conscience. Because as far as Ethan was concerned, he had already won. The paperwork was done. The accounts were restructured. The lawyers had been paid handsomely. And by noon that day, everything he had spent the last 7 months engineering would finally, officially, and permanently be his. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror for a long time, longer than usual. He adjusted his tie 3 times, not because it needed adjusting, but because he liked the way he looked doing it. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of face that made people assume he was trustworthy before he even opened his mouth. He had dark hair graying at the temples just enough to suggest authority, and eyes that could go warm or cold, depending entirely on what the moment required of him. He had always been good at reading rooms, good at knowing which version of himself to deploy and when. He told himself while looking in that mirror that what he had done was not cruel, it was simply efficient. Emily had never understood the way the financial world actually worked. She was soft. She was idealistic. She gave money away to strangers and called it charity, and seemed genuinely confused when Ethan pointed out that there were smarter things you could do with capital than hand it to people who hadn't earned it. She volunteered on weekends at food banks and homeless shelters while wearing no makeup and driving a 10-year-old SUV that embarrassed him every time he saw it parked in their driveway. She bought clothes from regular department stores. She didn't care about status the way a woman in her position married to a man like Ethan should have cared. In the beginning, he had found that quality almost charming. It made her seem humble, grounded, different from the women he usually attracted, who were always calculating, always measuring, always keeping score. Emily never kept score. She simply loved him, completely and without conditions. And for the first 2 years that had felt like a gift. Then it started to feel like a limitation. Then it started to feel like a weight around his ankles. By year 5, Ethan had already begun laying the groundwork for what came next. It hadn't started with cruelty. That was the thing Ethan told himself most often, and the thing he almost believed. It started with a slow and careful assessment of his situation. He was 40 years old. He was the vice president of operations at Meridian Energy Group, one of the largest mid-sized energy companies in the Southwest. He had worked for 14 years to get to that position. He had sacrificed weekends, holidays, sleep, and relationships to climb that ladder. And he had done it. He sat in a corner office on the 22nd floor. He drove a $70,000 car. He wore custom suits and attended charity galas and sat at tables with men whose net worth had 9 figures. And his wife drove an old SUV and volunteered at soup kitchens. The gap between what Ethan wanted his life to look like and what Emily was willing to participate in had grown slowly year by year like water carving through rock. Not dramatic, not sudden, just constant and patient and eventually impossible to ignore. Her name was Cassandra. She worked in communications at a consulting firm that did business with Meridian. She wore silk and heels and talked about restaurants and travel and investment portfolios with the same fluency that Emily talked about donation drives and community gardens. Cassandra thought Ethan was brilliant. She said so often and with enthusiasm. She laughed at everything he said. She looked at him the way Ethan had always believed he deserved to be looked at. He had been seeing her for 14 months by the time he walked into the offices of Graham and Associates. the most aggressive divorce attorney firm in Dallas, and told them he wanted to begin the process of separating from his wife. "What are we working with?" Marcus Graham had asked, leaning back in his leather chair with the practiced ease of a man who had heard every version of this conversation. "Joint assets," Ethan said. "A house, investment accounts, a business interest I have in a small hospitality venture. Her name is on some of it. Her income. She doesn't work. She volunteers. Nonprofits, charity organizations. She hasn't held a paying job in 6 years." Marcus had nodded slowly, tapping his pen against his legal pad. "So she'll be seeking alimony." "She'll be seeking everything," Ethan said flatly. "That's why I'm here. I want to make sure she doesn't get it." What followed over the next 7 months was something Ethan had designed with the same methodical precision he brought to his work. He began restructuring his personal finances 6 months before filing. He transferred significant assets into accounts that appeared on paper to be connected to business operations. He reclassified certain personal expenditures as corporate expenses. He created a paper trail that made his personal net worth appear considerably smaller than it actually was. He also, and this had required some creativity, began building a narrative around Emily. He told people she had a spending problem. He mentioned it casually at dinner parties. He brought it up in conversations with mutual friends. He quietly flagged certain transactions on their joint accounts, transactions that Emily had made for charity donations, for gifts, for household needs, and framed them in communications with his attorney as evidence of financial irresponsibility. He painted her systematically and patiently as a woman who could not be trusted with money. He did all of this quietly, carefully, without ever raising his voice or losing his composure. By the time he filed, he was confident the picture he had created was convincing. Emily, for her part, seemed unprepared. She had hired a family law attorney named Daniel Cho, a young man barely 5 years out of law school with a small practice in a nondescript office building in uptown Dallas. Ethan's team had looked into Cho. He was competent but inexperienced. He had never handled a case of this complexity. He had never gone up against Marcus Graham. Ethan had smiled when he read the background report his attorney's paralegal had put together. It was going to be fine. It was going to be more than fine. The morning of the hearing, Ethan arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes early with Marcus Graham and 2 associates. They filled an entire row in courtroom 4B on the 2nd floor of the George Allen Courts building. Ethan sat with his hands folded on the table, his posture relaxed, his expression pleasant. He knew like a reasonable man, a rational man, a man who was simply moving through an unfortunate situation with dignity and maturity. Emily arrived 12 minutes later. She wore a navy dress, simple and well-fitted. Her hair was pulled back. She wore small stud earrings and no other jewelry. She sat down beside Daniel Cho, set her bag under the chair, and folded her hands on the table exactly the way Ethan did. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the courtroom. Ethan gave her the faintest nod, the kind of polite acknowledgement you might offer a business acquaintance you ran into unexpectedly. Emily looked at him for one long second and then looked away. Something about the way she looked away bothered him slightly. There was no hurt in it, no anger, no desperation. She looked away the way you look away from something you've already finished deciding about. But Ethan pushed the feeling aside. He was being paranoid. She was nervous. She was putting on a show. The hearing began at 10:14 in the morning. Judge Patricia Halverson was 62 years old, silver-haired, and had been on the family court bench for 19 years. She had seen thousands of divorce proceedings. She ran her courtroom with a brisk, no-nonsense efficiency that kept attorneys from grandstanding and witnesses from wandering. She had a reputation for impartiality and precision. Ethan's attorney had told him privately that Halverson was actually preferable to the alternatives. "She doesn't get emotional," Marcus had said. "She follows the documentation, and our documentation is immaculate." For the first 2 hours, the proceeding moved almost exactly as Ethan had anticipated. Marcus Graham presented the financial restructuring in calm, methodical detail. He introduced documentation showing the current assessed value of the marital home, the joint investment accounts, and Ethan's business interests. He walked through a carefully constructed timeline of the couple's finances, highlighting what he characterized as a consistent pattern of unauthorized expenditure by Emily. He used the word pattern, 11 times in 40 minutes. He introduced bank statements, credit card records, and charitable donation receipts, all reframed as evidence of financial recklessness. Daniel Cho objected several times. Judge Halverson sustained some objections and overruled others. He cross-examined Ethan's financial expert, a forensic accountant named Wilkins, who delivered his testimony with the flat confidence of a man who had testified in courtrooms hundreds of times and found the whole business faintly tedious. Cho made some good points. He identified two inconsistencies in Wilkins's characterization of the investment account transfers. He pushed back on the donation receipts, arguing they reflected charitable giving that both parties had agreed to. But Cho was fighting uphill, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. At 1:45 in the afternoon, Judge Halverson began delivering her preliminary findings. The house was awarded to Ethan. The joint investment accounts, approximately $400,000, were awarded predominantly to Ethan with a small portion to Emily. The business interest in the hospitality venture was awarded to Ethan. Emily was assigned responsibility for certain joint debts. No spousal support was granted. Ethan heard each ruling like a note in a melody he had composed himself. He kept his expression appropriately neutral during the reading. He was above all things a man who understood optics. But the moment Judge Halverson finished speaking, the moment the gavel came down, something in Ethan simply could not help itself. He laughed. It came out of him before he could stop it. A full, genuine, unguarded laugh. He turned to Marcus Graham and clapped him on the back. "That's it," he said, loud, clear. "That's exactly it." He looked across the courtroom at Emily and he said, and he would replay this moment many times in the months that followed, each replay becoming increasingly difficult to sit with, "You should have taken the settlement, Emily. I offered you a fair deal. This is what stubbornness costs." Emily looked at him. Still calm, still quiet. Her attorney touched her arm lightly. She nodded at something Cho said and began gathering her papers. Several people in the courtroom gallery shifted uncomfortably. A woman in the second row pressed her lips together. Two men near the door exchanged a look, but Ethan didn't notice any of that. He was already mentally drafting the text he would send Cassandra, already thinking about where they would have dinner tonight, already calculating which accounts he would consolidate first thing in the morning. Marcus Graham touched his elbow. "Ethan." His voice carried a subtle note of warning. "Relax," Ethan said, still grinning. "We won. Enjoy it for 5 seconds." It was in that moment, right in that precise, careless, triumphant moment, that the courtroom changed temperature. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no sound, no announcement, no disruption. It was simply that the quality of the silence in the room shifted, the way the air changes before weather moves in. Several people were looking toward the back of the courtroom. Judge Halverson, who had been making notes on her pad, looked up. Her pen stopped moving. Ethan turned around. In the back row of courtroom 4B, an elderly man was rising slowly to his feet. He was in his late 70s, maybe 80. He wore dark trousers, a plain white shirt, and a jacket that looked like it had been worn many times before and had never been intended to impress anyone. His boots were leather broken in and practical. His face was deeply lined the way faces get when they've spent decades under open sky rather than in climate-controlled offices. His hair was white and cut close to his head. His hands as he rose were the hands of someone who had worked with them. Large, capable still. He looked at first glance like a retired rancher, like somebody's grandfather, like the kind of man you might nod to respectfully on a street corner without pausing to wonder who he was. Judge Halverson set down her pen entirely. "Sir," she said. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of a woman who is choosing every word with unusual deliberateness. "Am I correct in understanding that you wish to address the court?" The old man nodded once. "Your Honor," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular unhurriedness of someone who has never in their life felt the need to rush. "I apologize for the timing. I wanted to hear the full proceeding before I made myself known." He paused. "My name is William Sterling." Judge Halverson sat very still. The name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. You could watch the recognition spread outward. The two associates at Marcus Graham's table both looked up simultaneously. A court reporter stopped typing for 3 full seconds. A bailiff near the door straightened almost imperceptibly. Marcus Graham himself turned around in his chair slowly, the way a man turns when he needs a moment to arrange his face before anyone can see it. Ethan watched all of this happen and understood none of it. "Who is that?" he said quietly to Marcus. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the old man with an expression Ethan had never seen on his attorney's face before. It took Ethan a moment to identify it. It was the expression of a man doing very fast arithmetic inside his head and not liking the numbers he was getting. "Marcus," Ethan said again, keeping his voice low, "who is William Sterling?" Marcus turned back to face forward. He picked up his pen, set it down, and picked it up again. "Sterling Resources," he said quietly. "Energy, mining, infrastructure. He's been in the industry since before either of us was born." He paused. "He's worth somewhere between $12 and $15 billion, depending on the quarter." Ethan stared at him. Then he turned slowly back toward the old man standing in the rear of the courtroom. William Sterling had not moved. He was still standing still, looking forward with the patient stillness of a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room and who found absolutely no need to announce it. Judge Halverson said, "Mr. Sterling, I understand you wish to inform the court of your relationship to one of the parties in this proceeding." "Yes, Your Honor." William Sterling clasped his hands in front of him unhurried. "Emily Carter. Emily Sterling, as she was born, is my daughter." The courtroom did not erupt. It was not that kind of moment. It was quieter than that, and somehow that made it worse. It was the silence of people absorbing something that fundamentally rearranged information they thought they already had. Ethan could feel people recalibrating around him, shifting in their seats, reassessing everything they had just witnessed over the last several hours in the sudden disorienting light of this new fact. Emily, his Emily, who drove an old SUV and wore department store clothes and spent her weekends at soup kitchens. Emily Sterling, daughter of William Sterling. Ethan turned to look at her. She was still seated at the plaintiff's table. She was not looking at her father. She was not looking at Ethan. She was looking down at her folded hands on the table in front of her, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time for something to be over. 7 years. Ethan said out loud. He didn't mean to say it out loud. It came out of him involuntarily the way the laugh had come out 20 minutes earlier, except this time it wasn't triumph. It was something else entirely, something much colder. 7 years, and you never... Mr. Carter. Judge Halverson's voice cut across the room. "You will have an opportunity to speak. Right now, you will listen." William Sterling looked at Ethan for the first time. It was a brief look, the kind a man gives when he has already thoroughly assessed a situation and is confirming what he already knows. Then he looked back at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "I have significant information relevant to this proceeding, specifically regarding the financial documentation that was presented today and regarding the actual ownership structure of several assets that were included in this court's ruling." Marcus Graham was on his feet. "Your Honor, I must object to this highly irregular—" "Sit down, counselor." Judge Halverson's voice had acquired a quality it had not possessed during the previous 4 hours of testimony. It was not louder. It was simply absolute. Marcus Graham sat down. William Sterling reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He held it without opening it. 7 years ago, he said, my daughter married Ethan Carter. She married him without telling him the full extent of her family's financial circumstances because she had learned through previous painful experience that money has a way of complicating a person's reasons for loving someone. He said this without any particular emotion, as a man states a factual condition he has observed over many years. I respected her choice. I supported it. I also took certain precautions. He unfolded the document. The property at 4417 Sycamore Ridge Drive, the home that was the subject of today's hearing, was financed through a private trust administered through Sterling Capital Holdings. My daughter's name appears on the mortgage. Mr. Carter's name appears on the mortgage. What does not appear because it was not submitted as evidence in this proceeding is the original trust agreement that governs the property. He paused. That agreement contains a clause standard in all trust-financed properties under Sterling Capital, which specifies that in the event of marital dissolution arising from demonstrable financial fraud or misconduct by either party, title to the property reverts immediately and automatically to the Sterling Trust. It does not transfer. It does not remain subject to judicial division. It reverts. The room was so quiet, Ethan could hear his own breathing. Marcus Graham's hand was moving across his notepad quickly, his pen scratching fast and urgent. One of his associates was typing rapidly into a laptop. The other had his phone to his ear, speaking in a murmur that was very low and very fast. William Sterling continued, "The financial documentation presented by Mr. Carter's legal team today characterizes a pattern of irresponsible expenditure by my daughter. I have reviewed that documentation carefully over the past several weeks." He folded the document again and returned it to his pocket, with the calm precision of a man who knows there is more where that came from. "What it actually characterizes, Your Honor, is a systematic effort by Mr. Carter to misrepresent the household's financial activity in preparation for these proceedings. I have, over the past 6 months, engaged a team of forensic financial investigators to conduct a parallel examination of Mr. Carter's personal and professional financial records." Ethan felt something cold begin moving through his chest. "The findings of that investigation," William Sterling said, "have been shared with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Dallas County District Attorney's Office." The cold thing in Ethan's chest spread outward into his arms. "Additionally," William continued, and his voice remained exactly as calm and unhurried as it had been from the first word, "I have been in contact with the Board of Directors of Meridian Energy Group regarding certain discrepancies identified in the corporate financial records that appear to involve Mr. Carter's operational accounts." Ethan turned to Marcus Graham. He turned to him because Marcus Graham was the most expensive attorney in Dallas and had promised him in this very building 6 months ago that this day would go exactly as they had planned. He turned to Marcus Graham because there was nowhere else to turn. Marcus was staring at his notepad. He was not writing anything. He was simply staring at it. "Marcus," Ethan said. Marcus looked at him, and in his attorney's eyes, Ethan saw something he had never seen there in 14 months of working together. He saw the unmistakable, carefully controlled expression of a man who is beginning to calculate how quickly he can create distance between himself and his client. "We're going to need to speak privately," Marcus said quietly. "Right now." But before either of them could move, the doors at the back of courtroom 4B opened, and everything Ethan Carter had built one careful lie at a time began to come apart at exactly the speed it deserved. 2 men in dark suits entered the courtroom. They moved with the particular quiet efficiency of men who have entered many rooms in exactly this way. One of them carried a document case. The other spoke briefly to the bailiff near the door. The bailiff looked at Judge Halverson. Judge Halverson nodded once. Emily, still seated at the plaintiff's table, did not turn around to look. She already knew who they were. She had known they were coming. She had known for 6 months that this day would unfold in this direction, because 6 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in Wyoming, she had sat across a kitchen table from her father and told him everything. Every lie she had uncovered, every account she had traced, every piece of documentation she had quietly, carefully over 18 patient months assembled. And her father had looked at her across that kitchen table, and he had said very quietly, "All right, leave it with me." Now Ethan Carter sat in courtroom 4B and watched 2 federal agents approach the bench, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something he had almost forgotten was possible. He felt small. He felt exposed. He felt the particular nauseating vertigo of a man who has spent years believing he was the only one playing the game and has just discovered that every move he thought he was making in secret was being watched, cataloged, and answered with patience he couldn't have imagined. He looked at Emily. She was finally looking at him, not with anger, Not with satisfaction. Not even with sadness, though there had been more than enough sadness in the past several years to justify it. She looked at him with something much harder to receive than any of those things. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you understand them completely and have come to a full and final peace with what you understand. Like he was already the past. Like he was already settled. Like she had already moved 1,000 miles away from everything they had been, and she had done it quietly and privately long before this day without making a single announcement. Ethan opened his mouth. He didn't know what he intended to say. He didn't have words yet. He was still somewhere behind the words, still in the moment before language arrives, still trying to find the thought that would make any of this make sense. But Marcus Graham's hand came down firmly on his arm. "Don't," his attorney said. And his voice, for the first time in their entire professional relationship, carried no confidence whatsoever. "Ethan, do not say anything, not one word. Do you understand me?" In the back of the courtroom, William Sterling sat back down in his chair. He reached for his coffee cup. He took a slow, unhurried sip. He did not look triumphant. He did not look satisfied. He looked like a man who has done what needed to be done and is now simply waiting for the rest to follow. Outside the tall windows of the courthouse, Dallas went on as it always did, traffic and noise, and the ordinary business of a city that doesn't pause for any single man's undoing. But inside courtroom 4B on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the architecture of Ethan Carter's carefully constructed life was beginning its collapse. Not with an explosion, not with drama, with something quieter and in many ways more devastating, with the arrival of truth. And the truth, as it turned out, had been patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment. Emily Sterling folded her hands again on the table in front of her, breathed in, breathed out. And for the first time in 7 years, she felt the specific lightness of a weight that has been removed, not violently, not triumphantly, but simply and completely and without ceremony, the way a burden finally and permanently leaves the shoulders of a person who has carried it long enough. She was not yet free. There was still much ahead testimony investigation proceedings that would stretch into months. There were documents to review and statements to give, and an entire legal process that had just begun its next and far more complicated chapter. But sitting in that courtroom with her father's quiet presence behind her and the truth finally present in the room, Emily Carter. Emily Sterling felt the first real breath she had taken in years. And across the courtroom, Ethan Carter, who had laughed so loudly just 20 minutes ago that the sound had bounced off the marble walls, sat in complete silence and began to understand that the game he thought he had won had never been the game at all. The laughter hadn't fully faded from the courtroom when it happened. Not a sound, not a shout, just a presence. The slow, deliberate sound of a man rising from a wooden bench in the very last row of the gallery. A single motion unhurried the way a man moves when he has all the time in the world because he knows something no one else in the room does yet. Judge Patricia Holloway had been on the bench for 19 years. She had presided over custody battles that turned violent asset disputes that stretched across 3 states, fraud cases that unraveled in real time on her courtroom floor. She was not a woman who startled easily. But when she looked up from her paperwork and saw who was standing in the back of her courtroom, her pen stopped moving. She recognized him before he said a single word. Half the room didn't notice yet. Ethan was still turned toward his attorney, still riding the high of the ruling, already calculating the next move, already thinking about the call he would make to his mistress Vanessa, who was waiting at a wine bar 4 blocks away with a bottle of champagne on ice. Douglas Kress was sliding papers into his briefcase with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. The court reporter was logging the final notations. Nobody was looking at the back row. Emily was. She had turned slightly in her chair, not to look at the old man. She already knew he was there. She had known since the moment she walked into the building that morning and spotted his truck in the parking lot. The same truck he'd driven for 11 years, the same Wyoming plates. She had not acknowledged him. She had not needed to. Some things between a father and a daughter don't require signals. She just sat quietly and waited for the room to catch up. The old man cleared his throat once. That was all. One quiet sound. And somehow it cut through the noise the way a single note from a tuning fork cuts through a crowded room. Heads turned. The murmuring stopped. Even Ethan's attorney paused mid-motion, his hand hovering over his briefcase clasp, his instincts telling him something had shifted before his brain could name what. "Your Honor," the man said. His voice was low and even, the voice of someone who had spent decades speaking to people who didn't always want to hear what he had to say, and who had learned that volume was rarely necessary when clarity would do. "I apologize for the interruption. I wonder if I might have a brief moment to address the court." Judge Holloway looked at him over the top of her glasses. "And you are?" He walked forward then, slowly. He was in his early 70s with white hair cut short and a rancher's tan that stopped at the collar of his plain cotton shirt. His hands were large and calloused, and he held a battered leather portfolio under one arm like a man carrying a Bible. He reached the bar and stopped. "My name is William Sterling," he said. "I am Emily Carter's father." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Judge Holloway set her pen down completely. At the plaintiff's table, Douglas Kress had gone very still. His hand was still on his briefcase clasp, but he was no longer moving. His eyes had narrowed in the specific way of a man whose well-constructed certainty has just developed a crack. Ethan turned. He turned slowly the way a person turns when they are certain they have misheard something and are about to correct the misunderstanding. He turned, and he looked at the old man standing at the bar of the court, and he felt something he had not felt in a professional setting in years. He felt confused. "Sterling," Ethan said not loudly, almost to himself. "Emily's her father is out of the picture. He stopped. He looked at Kress. Her file said her father was deceased." Kress did not respond immediately. Something was moving behind his eyes, something that looked, if you knew what to look for, very much like recalculation. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Holloway said carefully, "this proceeding has already concluded. I've issued my ruling. You understand that any intervention at this stage would require—" "I understand, Your Honor," William said. He placed the leather portfolio on the bar in front of him and opened it with the unhurried precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times and was in no rush to perform it. "I am not here to contest the ruling on the grounds of the marriage itself. I am here because there are material facts relevant to this court's determination of asset ownership that were not disclosed during these proceedings." He paused. "Specifically regarding the property at 4814 Westover Lane, Preston Hollow, Dallas, Texas." Ethan's stomach dropped. He couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason, not yet, not based on what had been said, but something in his body understood before his mind caught up. Some animal instinct that had kept him alive through years of cutthroat corporate maneuvering sent a signal from his gut to his chest, and the signal said, "Run." He didn't run. He stood there. "The property," William continued, his voice unchanged, "was originally financed through a private lending vehicle established by Sterling Family Holdings, a Wyoming trust entity of which I am the sole trustee. The mortgage documentation signed at closing contains a covenant that was not disclosed to my daughter at the time of signing." He removed a set of documents from the portfolio and placed them precisely on the bar. "That covenant specifies that in the event of marital dissolution, triggered by documented financial misconduct or fraud on the part of the borrowing party, ownership of the property reverts in full to the Sterling Family Trust, not to the marital estate, not to either spouse, to the trust." The courtroom was so quiet that Ethan could hear his own breathing. "The borrowing party," William said, and for the first time he looked directly at Ethan, "is defined in the mortgage agreement as Ethan James Carter, sole signatory." Ethan's attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This man has produced documents that have not been entered into evidence. He has no standing in this proceeding, and any claims regarding third-party property interests should have been raised. They are being raised now," William said without raising his voice or looking away from the judge, "because the fraud that triggered this covenant was only fully documented in the last 72 hours. Judge Holloway held up one hand. Kress sat down. She looked at the documents on the bar for a long moment, then looked at William. "Mr. Sterling, I'm going to need you to be very precise about what you're alleging." "I'm not alleging anything, Your Honor." He reached into the portfolio again. I'm presenting findings. My investigators have spent the last 11 months examining the financial records of this marriage. What they found is a systematic transfer of marital assets through a shell company registered in Nevada under the name of a third party. The total value of assets moved through that entity is approximately $1.2 million. The documentation includes wire transfer records, internal communications, and sworn statements from 3 individuals with direct knowledge of the transactions. He set a second set of documents beside the first. I am also presenting evidence of forged financial records submitted to this court, which were used to support the plaintiff's characterization of my daughter as financially irresponsible. Ethan grabbed Cress by the arm. "Do something," he whispered. "Say something. Object. Stand up." "On what grounds?" Cress said quietly. His voice had changed. The confidence was gone. In its place was the careful neutrality of a man who was rapidly determining the distance between himself and his client's legal exposure. "I don't care what grounds. That's what I pay you for." "Ethan," Cress looked at him directly for the first time since the old man had stood up. "If what he's saying is accurate, this is no longer a divorce proceeding." Ethan stared at him. "What does that mean?" Cress did not answer. He was already looking toward the back of the courtroom. Ethan turned to follow his gaze, and that was when he saw them. 2 men in the 3rd row who had not been there when the hearing started. Dark suits, visitor badges, the kind of posture that comes from spending years in federal buildings. One of them caught Ethan's eye and did not look away. "Those are federal agents," Cress said quietly. "I'd recognize them anywhere." Ethan felt the floor tilt. Not literally, but the sensation was physical, a sudden wrongness in the geometry of the room, as though the walls had moved 3 inches closer while he wasn't looking. He reached for the back of his chair and gripped it. Judge Holloway was speaking again. She had called a recess. She was asking the bailiff to ensure that no one left the courtroom. She was looking at the documents William Sterling had placed on her bar with an expression Ethan had never seen on a judge's face before. Not skepticism, not impatience, something much worse than either of those things. Recognition. She had seen something in those papers that she recognized, something that confirmed rather than contradicted, and whatever it was, it had just transformed the nature of the afternoon entirely. William stepped back from the bar. He turned, and for just a moment, his eyes moved past Ethan, entirely past Cress, past the agents in the 3rd row, and found Emily at the respondents' table. His expression, which had been composed and precise for everything he'd said in the last 4 minutes, shifted then into something private, something that had nothing to do with courts or documents or financial covenants. He gave her the smallest nod, the kind that means, "I'm here. I have you. You're not alone in this." Emily looked at her hands, then she looked back at him, and she nodded once in return. Ethan watched the exchange and felt something crack open in his chest that he had no name for. He had known Emily for 7 years. He had lived with her, eaten with her, slept beside her, fought with her, dismissed her, ignored her, and ultimately tried to strip her of everything she owned. And in all that time, in all those years, she had never once mentioned her father. Not once. No stories about childhood, no references to Wyoming, no phone calls he'd noticed, no visits he'd been aware of. He had built an entire internal portrait of her as a woman without resources, without backup, without anyone standing in her corner, and he had built his entire strategy on that portrait. And now he was standing in a courtroom looking at an old man who had just detonated that portrait from the inside, and he was realizing with a cold and creeping clarity that the portrait had always been wrong. She had known. She had always known who she was and where she came from. She had chosen to live simply. She had chosen not to use her family's name or money. She had chosen him without any of it offered him something real, and he had looked at the simplicity of her life and seen nothing worth preserving. He had called her ordinary. That thought arrived in his mind with the weight of something final. The recess lasted 12 minutes. Ethan spent most of it standing against the wall near the plaintiff's table, while Cress made quiet phone calls that he clearly did not want Ethan to hear. After the second call, Cress came back with his briefcase under his arm and a look on his face that Ethan associated with corporate attorneys who were about to deliver information that could not be delivered gently. "I need to tell you something," Cress said. "Tell me." Ethan said. The documents he produced, I've seen the outline of them. One of my associates was able to pull the Nevada LLC registration while we were in recess. He paused. Ethan, the LLC is traceable. Whoever set this up did not use sufficient insulation. The wire transfers are documented in a way that connects directly to accounts in your name. Ethan said nothing. And the mortgage covenant, I've seen instruments like that before, used by high-net-worth families who want to protect assets during their children's marriages without the children knowing the full extent of the protection. They're legal. They're enforceable. And if this one says what he claims it says, you don't own that house. You never did. The ruling I won for you this morning regarding the property is void. That's not possible, Ethan said. His voice sounded strange to him, thin. I reviewed every document. My guy reviewed every document. Did your guy know to look for a trust instrument filed in Wyoming? Ethan didn't answer, because apparently Kress said no one did. The bailiff announced that court was resuming. People moved back to their seats. Ethan moved on autopilot, walking back to the plaintiff's table and sitting down in his chair and placing both hands flat on the table in front of him, the way he did in boardroom meetings when he needed to project stability he didn't feel. Judge Holloway returned to the bench. She did not look like a judge finishing a routine morning of domestic proceedings. She looked like a judge who had spent 12 minutes reading something that had changed the nature of her afternoon. Ethan thought the way people look when something they thought was a simple transaction has revealed itself to be something much larger and much more serious. I have reviewed the initial documentation presented by Mr. Sterling, she said, and I am placing my earlier ruling in abeyance pending a full review of the asset claims and the fraud allegations contained in these materials. I am also referring the financial records submitted today to the U.S. Attorney's Office for independent review. She looked directly at Ethan then. Mr. Carter, I want to be very clear. You remain free to go today. However, I would strongly advise you to retain counsel for matters beyond divorce proceedings. Ethan heard the words. He processed them individually. He understood each one, but they reached him through a layer of unreality, as though the courtroom had become a film he was watching rather than a room he was standing in. Then one of the men in the dark suit stood up. He walked toward the bar slowly. He removed a credentials case from his breast pocket and opened it on the bar, without drama, without any of the urgency you'd see in a television courtroom. He was calm, the way federal agents are calm when they have already done the hard work, and the rest is just procedure. Special Agent Daniel Carr, he said, IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Your Honor, we have been conducting a parallel investigation into the financial matters referenced in Mr. Sterling's documentation. We are prepared to cooperate fully with the referral. He paused, then he turned and looked at Ethan. Mr. Carter, we will need to speak with you at your earliest convenience. Ethan looked at his attorney. Kress was already standing, already closing his briefcase, already moving with the specific energy of a man creating distance. Douglas, Ethan said. Kress stopped. He looked at Ethan with an expression that contained no apology and no warmth, just the flat professional assessment of a man who had just redefined the boundaries of his engagement. My representation in this matter covered the divorce proceeding, he said quietly. What you're looking at now is federal. You need a different kind of attorney, Ethan. I can give you some names. He set a business card on the table. Then he walked out. Ethan sat alone at the plaintiff's table. Across the room at the respondent's table, Emily had not moved. She sat exactly as she had sat when the morning began, hands folded back straight, her eyes forward, not watching Ethan unravel, not performing satisfaction, just present, just still. And next to her, Marcus Webb, the soft-faced attorney in the rumpled jacket whom Ethan had dismissed as a non-factor, was quietly organizing his papers with the practiced calm of a man who had known perhaps for some time exactly how this morning was going to end. William Sterling stood at the back of the room again. He had returned to his seat in the last row after addressing the court. He sat with his portfolio on his knee, and he watched the proceedings with the patience of a man who understood that the most important moments in life rarely arrive with fanfare. They arrive quietly after a long wait, after a great deal of invisible work, after everyone who underestimated you has finished congratulating themselves. Ethan looked across the room one more time. Emily finally turned her head. Their eyes met for just a moment, the last real moment of contact between two people who had once stood in a church and made promises they had, at least one of them, never truly meant. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She looked the way a person looks at the end of something that cost them more than they ever showed. Tired, and beneath the tired, something else. Something that looked quietly and without performance like relief. Then she looked away. And Ethan understood, sitting alone at that table, while federal agents compared notes behind him, and his attorney's business card sat untouched beside his hand, that the woman he had called ordinary had just watched him lose everything, and had felt nothing about it except free. The most dangerous opponent, he was learning too late, is never the one who threatens you loudest. It's the one who waits. The business card was still sitting on the table untouched when the second federal agent approached Ethan from the left side. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just close enough to make it clear that the radius of Ethan's free movement had just become considerably smaller without anyone saying so explicitly. The agent, younger than Carr, with the kind of careful neutrality that comes from training rather than nature, placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of Ethan and stepped back. Ethan looked at it without picking it up. It was a preservation order, a legal directive freezing all financial accounts, investment portfolios, and business assets connected to his name, pending the outcome of a federal financial investigation. It had been signed by a federal magistrate at 9:17 that morning, before the divorce hearing had even begun. They had come prepared. They had always been prepared. This had not been improvised in response to William Sterling's appearance. This had been scheduled, coordinated. The courtroom appearance was not the beginning of something. It was the final act of something that had been running parallel to Ethan's careful plan for months, perhaps longer, in a direction he had never once looked. He read the document twice, then he set it down. "I want to call my attorney," he said. "You're free to do that," Agent Carr said from across the room. "Mr. Kress has already left the building, but you're welcome to contact whoever you'd like." The way he said it was not unkind. That almost made it worse. Ethan reached for his phone. He unlocked it and scrolled to Vanessa's name. The woman who was 4 blocks away at a wine bar with champagne on ice. The woman he had told 2 nights ago that by noon today everything would be settled and they could start making real plans. He stared at her name for a moment. Then he put the phone face down on the table. He couldn't explain why. Some instinct told him that making that call in this room in this moment would cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. Marcus Webb was speaking quietly to Emily at the respondents' table. Ethan watched them without appearing to watch them. Webb had his hand on a manila folder and he was pointing to something inside it, and Emily was nodding slowly, her expression focused and calm in a way that no longer looked like the quiet passivity Ethan had always interpreted it as. It looked he was beginning to understand, like the composure of someone who had been ready for this day for a very long time. William Sterling had not moved from the back row. He sat with the same stillness he'd had since the moment he rose from that bench. The leather portfolio on his knee, watching the room with the patient attention of a man who had learned long ago that the most important thing you can do after you've said what needs to be said is simply wait for the room to process it. Judge Holloway called the proceeding back to order at 11:43. She looked out at the room the way a captain looks at a ship that has just encountered unexpected weather, assessing, calculating, keeping her voice steady, because the room needed someone to keep their voice steady. "Given the material presented this morning," she said, "and the involvement of federal investigators, I am formally vacating my earlier asset ruling in its entirety. All determinations regarding property investment accounts and financial settlement are suspended indefinitely, pending the outcome of the federal investigation and a full forensic accounting of the marital estate." She looked at Ethan over her glasses. "Mr. Carter, do you understand what I've just said?" Ethan stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good. I want to be clear that this court takes allegations of fraudulent financial documentation submitted to it extremely seriously. If the evidence presented today is substantiated, you will be looking at charges that extend well beyond the civil proceedings that brought you here this morning." She brought down her gavel once, clean, final, and that sound, that single sharp crack of wood on wood, was the sound of Ethan's carefully constructed world splitting directly down its center. His phone buzzed on the table. He turned it over. The name on the screen was one he recognized immediately. Raymond Hollis, the CEO of Hartwell Energy Solutions, the man who had been 3 months away from promoting Ethan to Vice President of Corporate Development. The call Ethan had been waiting for in a different version of this morning would have been a congratulatory one. Raymond calling to say the promotion paperwork was ready and could Ethan come in Thursday to sign. He answered it. "Raymond, Ethan." The voice on the other end was flat, controlled, the voice of a man who had made difficult calls before and had learned to strip them of anything that wasn't necessary. "I'm going to make this brief. I've been on the phone with our legal team for the last 40 minutes. We are aware of what happened in court this morning. We are aware of the federal preservation order." A pause. "We're also aware that 3 of the offshore accounts flagged in the investigation are connected to transactions that passed through Hartwell subsidiary accounts over the last 2 years. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. "Raymond, I'm not calling to discuss it. I'm calling to inform you that your employment with Hartwell Energy Solutions is terminated effective immediately. Your access credentials have already been revoked. Security will have your personal items boxed by end of day. Do not come to the building." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'm sorry it ended this way, Ethan. I genuinely am." The line went dead. Ethan stood holding the phone against his ear for a moment after the call ended, the way people sometimes do when they need a second to let the body catch up with what the mind has just received. Then he lowered it slowly and set it back on the table. Raymond Hollis had been his champion at Hartwell for 6 years. The man who had fast-tracked his career, defended his aggressive methods to the board, put his own reputation on the line for Ethan more than once. And he had just delivered a termination in under 90 seconds without a single expression of uncertainty about the decision. That was the part that landed heaviest, not the termination itself, the certainty. Raymond had not called to ask questions. He had called because the questions had already been asked and answered, and what remained was simply the administrative task of cutting the connection cleanly. Agent Carr appeared at Ethan's elbow, quietly, without announcement. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we'd like you to come with us for an interview. You're not under arrest at this time. You have the right to have an attorney present. We'd encourage you to exercise that right." Ethan looked at him. "Am I going to be arrested?" Carr's expression did not change. "That depends on how the next few weeks develop. Right now we're gathering information, but I'd encourage you not to go too far." It was the kind of thing that sounds almost reasonable until you process what it actually means. Don't go too far. As though the radius of a man's freedom could be measured in blocks. As though the life Ethan had spent 9 years constructing could be reduced in the space of a single morning to a perimeter. He nodded. "I'll get an attorney and contact you." Carr gave him a card. Ethan took it. Their hands didn't quite touch. Across the room, Emily was standing now. She had her bag over one shoulder, and she was shaking Marcus Webb's hand with genuine warmth, saying something quiet that made the older attorney smile in the way people smile when they've carried something heavy for a long time and have just been told they can set it down. Then she turned toward the back of the room, toward her father. William had risen from the bench and was making his way forward through the gallery. He moved slowly, not because his body required it, but because he was a man who had never needed to rush toward anything. When he reached Emily, he didn't say anything immediately. He put one large, calloused hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into it slightly, just slightly for one moment, before straightening. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. "You want to get out of here, more than anything." They walked toward the exit together. William on her left, his portfolio tucked under his arm, his eyes moving once more across the room with the unhurried thoroughness of a man doing a final inventory. His gaze crossed Ethan's for exactly 1 second. He did not slow. He did not acknowledge. He simply looked the way you look at something you've already fully assessed and kept walking. The courtroom door closed behind them, and Ethan was left standing at the plaintiff's table alone with a federal preservation order on the table in front of him, a dead cell phone in his hand, no attorney, no job, no house, and the slowly arriving understanding that the champagne 4 blocks away was going to go flat. He called Vanessa at 12:04. She answered on the fourth ring. He could hear background noise, the wine bar probably, the sound of a normal Tuesday afternoon continuing without awareness of what had just happened in a Dallas courtroom. "How'd it go?" she asked. Her voice was bright, anticipatory. "Vanessa." He stopped. He didn't know how to start. He had spent 14 months preparing for this morning, and he had not prepared a single word for this conversation. "Things went differently than I expected." A pause. "What does that mean?" "It means I need you to listen carefully, and I need you not to panic." Another pause, longer this time. "Ethan, what happened?" He told her. Not everything, not yet. Not the federal agents or the CEO call or the full scope of what the preservation order covered. He told her the version a man tells when he's still hoping the next sentence he says will make the previous one smaller. He told her that there had been a complication, that Emily's father had appeared and produced some documents, that there was a temporary freeze on his accounts while some things got sorted out. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Your accounts are frozen," she said finally. "Temporarily." "Ethan." Her voice had changed. The brightness was gone. In its place was a careful, measured quality that he had not heard from her before. "How temporary are we talking? I don't know yet. And the house—" He hesitated 1 second too long. "The house is complicated," he said. "Okay." She said it the way people say okay when they mean something very different from okay. "I need to think. Can I call you back?" "Vanessa, I just need a minute to think." She hung up. He stood there. The courtroom was nearly empty now. A few people from the gallery lingered the way people linger after something unexpected, not quite ready to return to ordinary life. The court reporter was covering her equipment. One of the federal agents was on a call near the window. Ethan's phone buzzed again. He looked at it expecting Vanessa's name. Instead, it was a number he didn't recognize with a Nevada area code. He stared at it for a moment. Then he let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again. Same number. He let it go again. It buzzed a third time. Different number this time. Colorado area code. He didn't answer that one either. He was beginning to understand that the calls would keep coming from numbers he recognized and numbers he didn't, from people whose connections to him ran through the same financial channels that federal agents were now examining, and that none of those calls were going to be pleasant. He needed a criminal defense attorney, not a divorce litigator, not a corporate counsel. A criminal defense attorney, the kind who takes calls on short notice and doesn't ask too many questions in the first conversation. He scrolled through his contacts, trying to think of someone, anyone who might have a name. He thought of 5 different people. He called 3 of them. 2 didn't answer. The third answered, listened to 30 seconds of explanation, and said carefully that he wasn't sure he was the right resource for this particular situation, but he would make some inquiries and be in touch. He did not sound like a man who intended to be in touch. At 12:38, Ethan walked out of the courthouse into the midday heat with no plan and no attorney and no way to access the money in any account connected to his name. He stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, blinking in the sun, feeling the specific disorientation of a man whose morning has been so thoroughly detonated that his body hasn't yet received the signal to start grieving. There were cameras. Not many. 2, maybe 3. Local news photographers who had picked up on the federal angle through the courthouse communications channel and had arrived quickly enough to catch the back half of the story. One of them called Ethan's name. He didn't answer. He kept walking. One of them got a shot of him on the steps before he reached the sidewalk, and that shot a man in a gray suit and silver tie coming down courthouse steps alone, his face unreadable. His hands at his sides would be the image that ran beside the story when it broke 3 hours later on the local evening news under the headline, "Hartwell Executive Faces Federal Fraud Probe Following Divorce Hearing." By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the story had been picked up by 2 national financial news outlets. By 6 o'clock, it had reached the business desk of a major newspaper. By 8 o'clock, when Ethan was sitting in the living room of a friend's apartment because he had nowhere else to go and could not access his credit cards, his face was on 3 different news websites above captions that contained the words "alleged fraud" and "federal investigation" in various combinations. His phone had stopped buzzing 2 hours earlier, not because the calls had stopped, because the battery had died and he did not have the charger with him because the charger was in the house that was no longer legally his. He sat in his friend's apartment, and he stared at the wall, and he understood with the slow-arriving completeness of a man whose defenses have finally run out of ammunition that the morning had not been a setback. It had been an ending. The things he had spent 14 months building, the documentation, the legal architecture, the narrative of Emily as the problem, the careful positioning of himself as the reasonable party in an unreasonable marriage, had not just failed. They had reversed. The very precision of his preparation, the paper trail he had constructed, the meticulous movement of money through layers of corporate structure, had given federal investigators exactly what they needed. He had not been too careless. He had been too thorough. He had created records so detailed, so traceable, so complete, that an 11-month investigation had been able to reconstruct every transaction to the dollar. He thought about William Sterling. He thought about the man sitting in the back row of that courtroom since the start of the morning, holding a leather portfolio, watching, not arriving dramatically at the last moment, sitting there, present, patient, from the beginning. He thought about Emily's face when she looked at her father, the smallness of that nod, the private language of it, the way it spoke of a relationship so deep and so quietly maintained that 7 years of living with someone had not exposed even the surface of it. How long had William known about the investigation? How long had he been coordinating with the federal agents? How long had he been watching Ethan dismantle a marriage that his daughter had entered in good faith, using money and resources and power that Emily had deliberately kept invisible because she believed that love should not require a safety net? And how long Ethan now wondered, sitting in the dark, in a borrowed apartment with a dead phone and the quiet wreckage of everything he had built, had Emily known that her father was watching? Because she had not looked surprised. Not once. Not when William stood up. Not when the federal agents approached the bar. Not when the judge vacated the ruling. Emily had sat at that table with her hands folded and her back straight, and she had watched the morning unfold with the specific stillness of someone who has known for a long time how a story ends and has simply been waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. That realization arrived in Ethan's chest like something cold. She had known. She had sat across from him in that courtroom, and she had let him laugh. She had let him perform his victory for the gallery. She had let him have the full, uninterrupted experience of believing he had won. And she had done it not out of cruelty, because Emily was not cruel, but out of something that was harder to define and more difficult to argue with. She had done it because she no longer needed anything from him. Not his acknowledgement, not his remorse, not even his understanding. She had walked into that courtroom free of the need for any of it, and she had walked out the same way beside her father without looking back. Vanessa had not called back. That fact settled into the room alongside everything else. He had not expected it to sting the way it did. He had told himself many times over the last 14 months that what he had with Vanessa was something solid, something real, something worth what he was doing to get to it. And now, in the first genuine test of that solidity, she had asked for a minute to think and had not returned. 1 minute, 4 hours, no call. He sat in the borrowed apartment, and he let the silence of the evening do what silences eventually do when there's nothing left to manage or perform or calculate. He sat with it. And the silence said back in the specific way that silence speaks to men who have spent years refusing to listen to it. You already knew. You knew what this was, and what she was, and what you were. And you chose it anyway, because choosing it was easier than choosing the thing you had, and didn't know how to value until it was gone. The wall he was staring at didn't offer anything in response to that. Outside, somewhere across the city, in a small rental apartment with simple furniture and a window that looked out over an unremarkable street, Emily Carter was probably doing something ordinary. Making tea, maybe, reading, calling her father to say goodnight, living the quiet life she had always been capable of, living the one she had never required Ethan to provide or understand or participate in, the life that had always been hers and that no amount of legal maneuvering had ever actually touched. He had taken the house. He had taken the accounts. He had taken 7 years of her time and her effort and her genuine, unhurried love. And he had left with nothing, while she, it turned out, had always had everything. 3 months passed the way months pass when a man has nothing left to measure time against except hearings and attorney consultations and the slow grinding machinery of federal proceedings that move on their own schedule regardless of what the person at the center of them needs or feels or fears. Ethan had found an attorney. His name was Conrad Briggs, 61 years old, a former federal prosecutor who had spent the last 20 years on the defense side of the courtroom and who had over those 2 decades developed the particular emotional remove of a man who has heard every version of every story and stopped being surprised by any of them. He charged $800 an hour. Ethan had paid the retainer with money borrowed from his brother in Phoenix, the only family member who had answered the phone in the first 72 hours after the courthouse, and the only one who had not asked for an explanation before agreeing to help. Conrad had laid out the situation in their first meeting with the clean efficiency of a surgeon describing a procedure. The federal investigation covered approximately $2.3 million in total transactions across a 4-year period. The Nevada LLC was the centerpiece, but investigators had also traced movements through 2 additional shell entities that Ethan had believed were sufficiently insulated. They were not. The forensic accountants the IRS had assigned to the case were, in Conrad's words, exceptionally thorough, which was the professional way of saying that they had found everything and then found the things beneath everything. "How bad is it?" Ethan had asked. Conrad had looked at him with the flat patience of a man who does not soften things, because softening things wastes time. Wire fraud, tax evasion, submission of fraudulent documents to a civil court, potentially conspiracy, depending on how cooperative the individuals involved in the LLC structure decide to be. He paused. "It's significant, Ethan. I won't tell you otherwise." "What are we looking at in terms of sentencing? If it goes to trial and you're convicted on all counts, 8 to 12 years federal, you'd serve 85%. Another pause. "If you cooperate fully, provide complete documentation, and accept a plea arrangement, we might get that down considerably. But I need you to understand something. Cooperation means full cooperation. There is no partial version of this that gets you a favorable result." Ethan had nodded and said he understood. He was not certain he understood, but he nodded. The weeks that followed were a kind of dismantling he had not anticipated because he had never genuinely believed he would have to face it. His apartment, a short-term rental he'd secured with his brother's help after the house reverted to the Sterling Trust, was small and sparsely furnished and had a parking lot view that he spent more time looking at than he would have admitted to anyone. He had no job. He had no access to his investment accounts while the preservation order remained in effect. He had a credit card with a modest limit that his brother had added him to as an authorized user, which was a humiliation of a specific and quiet variety that sat with him at odd moments during the day. His social circle had reduced itself with a speed that should not have surprised him, but did. The colleagues who had called him a visionary, the business contacts who had laughed at his jokes at company dinners and asked his advice on deals and treated proximity to him as a professional asset. They had not called. A few had sent brief, carefully worded texts in the first week. "We're thinking of you. Let us know if there's anything we can do." The kind of language that functions as a door, being closed politely rather than slammed. He had not responded to most of them. He had not known what to say that would not make him sound like he was asking for something. Vanessa had texted once 11 days after the courthouse. The message was 4 sentences. It said that she cared about him and always would, that she had thought carefully about the situation, that she believed they both needed space to figure out their separate paths forward, that she wished him well. It was, Ethan thought when he read it, the kind of message a person writes when they want to feel like they handled an exit with grace. And he could not bring himself to be angry about it because he had known sitting in his friend's apartment that first night with his dead phone and the borrowed silence that the call was never coming. He did not respond to her message either. He sat in his sparse apartment and he worked with Conrad on the cooperation agreement, and he waited. That was the dominant feature of those months. Waiting. Waiting for hearings, waiting for the investigation to complete its next phase, waiting for the plea negotiation to develop into something concrete. He had been his entire adult life a man of action, a man who operated on the principle that movement was always preferable to stillness, that the person who acts first controls the outcome. And now the outcome was controlling him, and there was nothing to do but sit inside it and let it move at its own pace. It was during this waiting 6 weeks after the courthouse that he received the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday in an envelope with no return address, handwritten in a script he didn't recognize. He opened it at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and he read it twice before he understood what he was reading. It was not from Emily. It was not from Conrad or from any of the federal investigators. It was from William Sterling. 3 pages handwritten on plain white paper in the careful, unhurried script of a man who writes letters the same way he speaks, without waste, without performance, with a precision that carries its own weight. It began, "I am not writing to cause you further pain. I am writing because there are things I believe you should know, and because I think you are, for perhaps the first time in your adult life, in a place where you are capable of hearing them." Ethan put the letter down. He picked up his coffee. He set it down. He picked the letter up again. William wrote that he had known about Ethan for longer than Ethan realized. Not from Emily. Emily had told her father almost nothing about the difficulties in the marriage, not out of shame, but out of a deeply held belief that her problems were hers to solve and her marriage was hers to navigate. What William had learned, he had learned on his own, because that was what William Sterling did when it came to the people he loved. He paid attention, quietly, consistently, without announcement. He had noticed the financial patterns first, not through any invasion of Emily's privacy, but through the simple fact that he was a man who had spent 50 years reading financial structures, and the structures surrounding his daughter's marriage had over time begun to read wrong. Too much separation, too many intermediary accounts. He had said nothing to Emily. He had hired investigators instead. What they found over the following 8 months had not shocked him. He had seen versions of it before in business, in partnerships that went wrong in men who mistook access to resources for ownership of them. What had grieved him, and he used that word grieved, and Ethan had to stop and read the sentence twice, was not the financial fraud. It was the pattern beneath it. The deliberate, systematic erasure of Emily's credibility, the documents designed to make her look irresponsible, the strategic isolation, the way Ethan had looked at a woman who loved him without condition and had seen nothing worth protecting. That grieved him because Emily was his daughter, and he had raised her to believe that love was worth the risk of vulnerability. And she had believed it genuinely all the way to the end of that marriage, and what she had received in return for that belief was a husband who spent 14 months building a legal case against her. Ethan had to set the letter down again at that point. He stood at the counter and he looked out the parking lot window and he breathed slowly for a moment. Then he picked it up. The second page was where William revealed the thing Ethan had not known, the thing that changed everything he thought he understood about the 7 years behind him. He had not been a stranger to Emily's life, William wrote. He had been present in it in a way that Ethan had never detected, not through Emily, through Ethan himself. The anonymous investor who had backed Ethan's first independent deal 6 years ago, the one that had established his reputation at Hartwell and accelerated his entire career trajectory, had been William Sterling. Structured through 4 intermediary entities, untraceable without the specific knowledge of where to look, designed to give Ethan the opportunity to demonstrate his capabilities without the weight of obligation or awareness. $380,000, deployed through a private equity vehicle that had never appeared in any document Ethan had seen with Sterling's name on it. Ethan read that sentence 3 times. The deal that had made him. The deal he had told the story of at every company dinner, every industry conference, every performance review. The scrappy independent financing he had secured through sheer tenacity and the right contacts. The origin story of everything. That deal had been William Sterling watching quietly from a distance, giving his son-in-law a chance to become the man his daughter believed he already was. He sat down. He hadn't planned to. His legs simply made the decision for him, and he found himself on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet and the letter in his hand, and something happening in his chest that he had not given space to in a very long time. He kept reading. There had been a second intervention, William wrote. 2 years later, when Hartwell had been considering cutting the division Ethan led due to a budget restructuring, a quiet recommendation from an anonymous industry contact had reached Raymond Hollis, suggesting that the division was undervalued and its lead executive was the kind of talent that competitors would move quickly to acquire. Raymond had taken the recommendation seriously. The restructuring had been redirected. Ethan's division had survived. His career had continued its upward arc. That recommendation had also come from William. And there had been a third, a board introduction at a Texas energy conference 4 years ago that had led directly to the Meridian contract, the largest single deal Ethan had ever closed, the one that had made his VP promotion almost certain. The board member who had made the introduction had been a longtime associate of Sterling Family Holdings. 3 interventions. 3 moments where the invisible hand of a man Ethan had never met, never acknowledged, never once considered, had reached quietly into the machinery of his career and ensured that a door remained open. Not to give him success, William was clear about that. Ethan had done the work, he had closed the deals, he had built the relationships. William had not manufactured outcomes. He had manufactured opportunities the way a man plants seeds in ground he does not own, hoping that whoever tends the garden will grow something worth the investment. He had hoped, William wrote, that the character revealed through those opportunities would be the character of a man worthy of leading what he had spent 50 years building. Sterling Resources was not simply a company. It was a legacy. Thousands of employees, decades of relationships, a responsibility that required not intelligence or ambition. There was no shortage of either in the world, but integrity. The specific, unglamorous daily practice of doing right by people who depended on you. He had watched Ethan move through each opportunity. He had watched him closely, and what he had seen consistently beneath the competence and the drive and the undeniable capability was a man who used people as instruments, who calculated relationships in terms of value and leverage, who looked at his own wife, a woman of genuine warmth and intelligence and quietly remarkable character, and saw a liability. That was not the man he needed. That was not the man Emily deserved. And so he had waited. He had let the marriage reveal itself because marriages always do given enough time. And when it had revealed itself clearly and completely, and with enough documented evidence to satisfy both a civil court and a federal investigation, he had acted. Not to punish Ethan, to protect Emily. The distinction mattered to William. He wrote it explicitly in the careful script that had now covered 3 pages of plain white paper and reached Ethan in a sparse apartment on a Tuesday morning with cold coffee on the counter. He had not engineered Ethan's destruction. Ethan had built that himself, transaction by transaction, decision by decision, over 14 patient months. William had simply ensured that when it fell completely, and that Emily was standing clear of it when it did. The letter ended with 1 paragraph. Ethan read it so many times that he eventually set the paper down and found he could recite it without looking. William wrote, "I do not know what kind of man you will be when you come out the other side of what is ahead of you. I suspect I will never know, and it doesn't matter much for the purposes of my family. But I think you are smart enough if you're willing to be honest in a way you haven't been to understand what you actually lost. It wasn't the house or the accounts or the career. Those things are replaceable for a man of your capabilities. What you lost was a woman who loved you without reservation and without agenda, and a future that I had spent years quietly preparing to offer you. That is not replaceable. I hope you sit with that. Not as punishment, as instruction." Ethan sat with it. He sat with it for the rest of that Tuesday and into the evening and through a night that he did not sleep through. He lay on the bed in his sparse apartment and he stared at the ceiling, and he let the letter do what it needed to do to him, which was to remove one by one the remaining structures he had built to avoid looking at himself directly. He had told himself in the 3 months since the courthouse that he had been unlucky, that the investigation had been overzealous, that William Sterling had weaponized his resources against a man who had simply made some aggressive financial decisions in the context of a marriage that was already over. He had told himself that Emily was not innocent in all this, that marriages fail for reasons that belong to both people, that he was not the villain of this story, so much as a man caught between ambition and circumstance. The letter dismantled all of it. Not because William Sterling was cruel, but because he was precise. Because he had written 3 pages without a single word of anger or contempt, without a single moment of satisfaction at what Ethan was going through, and because that absence of malice was in its own way more devastating than any accusation. A man who hated Ethan could be argued with. A man who simply saw him clearly and completely and without judgment was impossible to deflect. He thought about Emily's face in the courtroom. Not the moment after the ruling, not the moment when her father stood. Earlier than that. The moment the morning began when Ethan had walked to the plaintiff's table and glanced across the room, and their eyes had met briefly before he looked away. There had been something in her expression then that he had catalogued as resignation and moved past quickly because it had made him uncomfortable. He understood now what it actually was. It was the look of a woman who had already grieved the marriage, had already processed the loss, and was present in that courtroom, not with any remaining hope, but with the calm of someone who has done the necessary and difficult work of letting something go entirely. She had not been resigned, she had been free, and he had been so focused on the mechanics of winning that he had not recognized freedom when he was looking directly at it. The plea agreement was finalized on a Thursday in the 9th week of negotiations. Ethan stood in a federal courtroom in downtown Dallas in a dark suit that no longer felt like armor, and he entered a guilty plea on 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of submitting fraudulent documents to a civil court. The tax evasion charges were folded into the agreement in exchange for full cooperation and the complete financial documentation that Conrad had spent weeks compiling with Ethan's assistance. The agreement carried a recommended sentence of 4 years in a federal facility with eligibility for release at the 85% mark. Conrad called it a significant achievement given the scope of the original charges. Ethan nodded and thanked him and shook his hand and walked out of the courthouse into a gray November afternoon feeling something he couldn't immediately name. It took him until he reached the parking lot to identify it. Relief, not joy, not hope. Just the clean, exhausted relief of a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally, regardless of the consequences, set it down. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. He used those 6 weeks differently than he had used any comparable period in his adult life. He did not strategize. He did not calculate. He did not spend his hours constructing narratives or positioning himself or assessing his options. He spent them being still, which was something he had never been good at, and which required, he discovered, more effort than anything he had ever done in a boardroom. He called his brother in Phoenix, not to ask for anything, just to talk. His brother, whose name was Daniel, and who was 3 years older, and who had spent his entire life being somewhat baffled by the version of Ethan that had emerged from their shared childhood, answered and listened, and did not ask questions until Ethan stopped talking. Then he said quietly that he was glad Ethan had called, and that he had been worried for a long time, not since the courthouse. Before that, for years. That was the conversation Ethan had not expected to need, and did not realize he had been missing. He also wrote a letter, not to Emily, he understood with the clarity that the last months had given him, that reaching out to her served his needs and not hers, and that he had already spent 7 years prioritizing his needs over hers, and the pattern needed to stop even in its smallest expressions. He wrote to Marcus Webb, Emily's attorney. He wrote 3 paragraphs. He acknowledged that the financial documentation submitted to the court on his behalf had been fraudulent. He acknowledged that Emily had entered the marriage and conducted it with integrity. He asked Marcus to ensure that any restoration of assets or financial correction that should have been made as part of the original settlement be communicated to his attorney for immediate action. He did not ask for acknowledgement or response. Conrad processed the communication and ensured it was handled through proper legal channels. The day before sentencing, Ethan sat alone in his apartment with William Sterling's letter on the table in front of him, and he read it one more time. He had read it many times by now. He knew every sentence, but he read it again because there was something in the act of reading it, in the experience of sitting with words written by a man who had watched him fail and had not enjoyed it, that continued to offer something he couldn't get anywhere else. He read the last paragraph again, the one about what he had lost. And for the first time since the courthouse, not with self-pity and not with the dramatic recognition of a man performing remorse, but with the quiet and unglamorous honesty of a man finally willing to see himself accurately. Ethan Carter understood what he had actually done. He had been handed something rare. A woman who loved him without calculation, without agenda, without the transactional quality that defined every other significant relationship in his adult life. A woman who had chosen simplicity not because she lacked options, but because she genuinely believed that love was enough and that the rest was noise. A woman whose father, a man of extraordinary capability and resources, had spent years quietly preparing to welcome him into something that most men spend their entire lives building toward and never reach. And he had spent 14 months destroying it, not in a moment of passion or weakness, deliberately, methodically, with the same intelligence and precision that William had hoped to see applied to a legacy. He had been the diamond and had not known it. He had also held the diamond and had called it stone. The sentencing hearing lasted 40 minutes. The judge, a careful woman in her late 50s, who read her notes before speaking and spoke without hesitation, once she started imposed the recommended sentence with a brief statement that Ethan listened to completely and that he would remember for years. She said that the crime was not merely financial. The submission of fraudulent documents to a civil court, she said, was an attack on the integrity of the legal system that individuals depend on to protect them at their most vulnerable. The victim in this case had been vulnerable. She had trusted an institution to see her clearly. That trust had been deliberately subverted by a man who was capable of better and had chosen otherwise. Ethan was remanded into federal custody that afternoon. He did not look for cameras this time. He did not think about who was watching. He walked where he was directed to walk, and he carried with him nothing except the specific and finally honest understanding of a man who has lost what cannot be recovered and has decided too late for it to change the outcome, but not too late for it to change him, to stop pretending otherwise. Somewhere in Wyoming, on thousands of acres of open land that she had grown up on and returned to Emily Sterling, was living a life that had nothing in it that belonged to him anymore. He hoped it was a good one. He believed for the first time that it was. The first morning Emily woke up in Wyoming without the weight of the marriage on her chest, she didn't recognize the feeling immediately. She lay still for a moment, the way you do when something is different, but your body hasn't finished processing what. Then she understood. It was quiet. Not the quiet of a house where two people are avoiding each other, not the loaded quiet of a marriage that has run out of things to say. It was the other kind. The kind that belongs entirely to you, the kind that asks nothing and takes nothing and simply exists around you like air. She got up and made coffee and stood at the window of her father's ranch house and looked out at the land she had grown up on, and she felt something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to name it. She felt like herself. Not a version of herself adjusted for someone else's comfort. Not the smaller, quieter Emily who had learned over 7 years to take up less space, ask fewer questions, need less, expect less, and interpret the absence of cruelty as the presence of love. Just Emily. The original one. The one who had existed before Ethan Carter had looked at her across a charity auction and decided she was something he wanted to acquire. That first week back in Wyoming was not dramatic. There were no revelations delivered in speeches, no ceremonies of reclamation. She helped her father with the ranch books in the mornings because the ranch manager had retired and William had not yet replaced him and the numbers needed attention. She walked in the afternoons. She cooked dinner most evenings, simple food, the kind she had always preferred, and had spent years preparing for a man who ate it without comment. She slept deeply and woke without dread and went to bed without calculating what the next day would require her to manage. William watched all of this without comment. That was his way. He had raised Emily largely alone after her mother passed when Emily was 11, and he had learned during those years that the most useful thing a parent can offer a child who is healing is presence without pressure. He was there. He was consistent. He did not ask her to process out loud or perform recovery or arrive at gratitude on any schedule other than her own. But on the 8th day over dinner, he looked at her across the table and said, "I want to talk to you about something, when you're ready." "I'm ready," she said immediately. He smiled at that. It was a small smile, the kind that carries a long history in it. "You always were," he said. He told her about the foundation. He had been planning it for 2 years. Not as a response to the divorce. The initial conversations with his estate attorneys had begun long before the marriage showed its fractures openly. It was something he had wanted to do for a long time, a formal philanthropic structure funded by Sterling Family Holdings, focused specifically on economic empowerment for women navigating difficult transitions. Divorce, job loss, single parenthood, the specific, practical emergencies that fall into the gaps between what institutions offer and what people actually need. He had wanted Emily to lead it. Not as a courtesy, not as something to keep her occupied while she recovered, because she was in his assessment, which was not a sentimental assessment. William Sterling had not survived 50 years in the energy business by being sentimental about capability, the right person for it. She understood the populations it would serve, not abstractly but from the inside. She had spent years volunteering at food pantries and community organizations, not because it looked good, but because she genuinely cared, which was rarer than it sounded. And she had beneath the quiet exterior that Ethan had consistently mistaken for limitation, a clarity of purpose and a precision of attention that William had recognized in her since she was a child. It would be real work, he said, not a title. The foundation has a $12 million initial endowment. There are grant programs to design partnerships to build staff to hire. It will take everything you have. Emily looked at her father for a moment. Then she said, "When do I start?" He reached into the pocket of his shirt and set a business card on the table. Her name was already on it. Emily Sterling, Executive Director, Sterling Family Foundation. She picked it up. She looked at it. She set it back down. "You already had this made," she said. 3 weeks ago, he said. "You were that sure I'd say yes. I was that sure you were ready." He picked up his fork. "There's a difference." She started on a Monday. The foundation's operational office was in Cheyenne, a 2-hour drive from the ranch, and Emily made that drive on the first day with a travel mug of coffee and the windows down and the radio off because she wanted to think, and because thinking had become something she was relearning to do without monitoring herself for how it might land. She arrived at a modest office suite on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like new carpet and possibility, and she met the 3 staff members her father's team had already hired, 2 program coordinators and an administrative director, and she shook their hands and learned their names and listened to what they had built so far and asked questions for 2 hours straight. By the end of that first day, she had a legal pad full of notes and 3 pages of questions and the beginning of a framework that was entirely different from the initial program design the staff had been working from. Not better or worse at its core, just reoriented. Shifted from a model centered on financial grants towards something more integrated. Grants paired with mentorship, practical business education, access to legal resources. Because Emily had learned, from her own experience and from years of working alongside women at the food pantry and the community centers, that money alone doesn't rebuild a life. Structure does. Consistency does. The experience of being taken seriously by someone who has the resources to back that seriousness up. The program coordinator named Diane, who was 38 and had been with the project since its earliest planning stages, looked at Emily's framework at the end of that first day and said carefully, "This is a significant departure from what we had." "I know," Emily said. "Is that a problem?" Diane looked at the legal pad for another moment. "No," she said. "Actually, it's better. I just want to make sure we're aligned on the direction before we go further." "I want to be aligned with you," Emily said. "Tell me where you think it breaks down." Diane blinked. Then she smiled. It was the smile of someone who has spent time in rooms where the person at the head of the table asks questions but doesn't actually want answers. "Okay," she said. "Let's go through it." They stayed 2 hours past closing time that first day. The administrative director, a quiet man named Gareth, who had 20 years of nonprofit operations experience, ordered takeout at 6:30, and nobody complained. By 8 o'clock, they had a revised framework that was stronger than either the original or Emily's draft, because it incorporated perspectives that none of them had arrived with individually. Emily drove back to the ranch that night, feeling something she recognized from a long time ago. The satisfaction of a day spent building something that mattered in collaboration with people who were genuinely trying. She had forgotten what that felt like. Or rather, she had not forgotten, but she had spent years in a marriage that offered so few opportunities to experience it that the memory had faded to the quality of something half-imagined. It had not been imagined. It was real, and it was hers again. The first grant cycle launched 4 months after Emily took over as director. 37 applications, 12 awards. The recipients were women in various stages of rebuilding a woman in Casper who had left a 20-year marriage with 2 teenagers and no employment history and a business plan for a catering company that was detailed and realistic and needed $17,000 to become operational. A woman in Laramie who had aged out of the foster system, raised her younger siblings through her 20s, and at 31 was trying to complete the nursing degree she had deferred 3 times for other people's emergencies. A woman in rural Montana, just across the state line, who had been running an informal childcare cooperative out of her home for 6 years and needed legal incorporation support and initial operating capital to turn it into something that could serve her community properly. Emily read every application herself, all 37. She made notes in the margins. She asked her program coordinators to flag anything she had missed. She sat in on the review committee sessions, and she listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, she asked questions rather than delivering conclusions. She had learned through years of living with a man who talked to fill space and made decisions to demonstrate authority that the most effective leadership she had ever witnessed worked in exactly the opposite direction. The announcement of the first grant cycle generated more attention than any of them had anticipated. A journalist from a regional newspaper wrote a story that led with Emily's background, the daughter of a Wyoming billionaire who had walked away from Dallas society to run a foundation focused on women in crisis. And the story was picked up by a national women's interest publication, and then by a financial news site that covered it under the angle of impact investing and philanthropic innovation. The morning the national story ran, Emily's phone received 47 emails before 9 o'clock. Partnership inquiries, requests for speaking engagements, a message from a senator's office in Wyoming asking if the foundation would be interested in consulting on a state-level policy initiative regarding economic support for displaced homemakers. She sat at her desk and with her coffee and read through them methodically, flagging the ones that warranted immediate response and setting aside the ones that needed more consideration. Diane knocked on her office door at 9:15 with a printed copy of the national story and a look on her face that was trying to be professional and not entirely succeeding. "This is significant," Diane said. "It's a good story," Emily said. "We should use it carefully. I don't want the foundation to become about me." "It's not about you," Diane said, setting the printout on the desk. "It's about what you built." Emily looked at the story. Her name was in the headline. Her photograph taken at the Cheyenne office 2 weeks earlier ran beside it. She was looking slightly off camera, the way she sometimes did when she was listening to something, and whoever had taken the photo had caught that quality of attention that her father had always said was her most distinctive feature, not her intelligence, her attention. The way she made people feel that what they were saying was the most important thing being said anywhere in the world at that moment. She put the printout in the folder she kept for press materials and went back to her emails. Gareth appeared at her door 20 minutes later. "There's a woman on the phone," he said. "She says she's not calling about a grant. She says she wants to talk to whoever is actually running this thing. She's been on hold for 10 minutes and won't give her name." Emily looked up. "Put her through." The woman's name was Carol. She was 62, recently widowed, living in Colorado, and had spent 38 years running the administrative operations of her husband's construction company, without a salary, without a title, and without legal ownership of anything that the company had built. Her husband had died intestate, and his family had immediately contested the estate, and a probate process was underway that Carol's attorney had told her gently was not going in a favorable direction. She wasn't calling to apply for a grant, she said. She was calling because she had read the story and she needed to talk to someone who might understand, and she hadn't known who else to call. Emily listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't take notes. She just listened the way she always did, with the full and unhurried attention that made people feel that their story was being received rather than processed. When Carol finished, there was a brief silence. Then Emily said, I'm going to connect you with our legal resources coordinator. Her name is Patricia, and she's worked with probate and estate disputes for 20 years. She will take your call today, not tomorrow. And I want you to know that what you did for 38 years had value. The fact that the paperwork didn't reflect that doesn't change it. We're going to help you make the paperwork catch up." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sound like you understand this from the inside." Emily said, "I do." She did not elaborate. She transferred the call to Patricia and sat for a moment after the line switched over. She thought about how many Carols there were, how many women who had built things quietly without credit, without documentation, without the legal architecture to protect what they had contributed, and who found themselves at the end of something with nothing to show for the years they had given. She thought about how much of that was simply the result of trust. Trusting that the person you built something with would treat what you had contributed as real. Trusting that love was its own protection. Trusting as she had trusted that decency was the baseline rather than the exception. She had been wrong about that trust in the specific case of her marriage. But she had not been wrong about the principle. The principle was still true. Love should be its own protection. It simply required she had learned that you build it with someone who understood that it was a two-way architecture. Someone who understood that another person's trust was not a vulnerability to be exploited, but a gift to be honored. She had not found that in Ethan, but she had not stopped believing it was possible. 6 months into running the foundation, Emily received a piece of information through Marcus Webb, her attorney, that she had not sought and had not expected. Ethan had entered federal custody. Marcus sent a brief message simply noting the fact for her awareness without commentary. She read it once. She sat with it for a moment. Then she wrote back a single line, "Thank you for letting me know." She did not ask for details. She did not think about it again that day. But that evening, driving back to the ranch on the 2-lane highway with the Wyoming sky doing what the Wyoming sky does in the last hour before dark, which is to become something so large and so uncontained that it makes every human concern feel briefly like the correct size, she thought about Ethan. Not with anger. She had processed the anger in the months before the courthouse, in the long and private work of understanding what had happened to her and how she had allowed it and what she was going to do about it. The anger had served its purpose, and she had let it go because carrying it would have required giving him space inside her daily life that she was no longer willing to give. What she felt driving home under that sky was something quieter and more complicated, something that was not quite sympathy and not quite pity, but that lived in the same neighborhood as both. She thought about the man she had met at the charity auction 7 years ago. The version of him that had existed before ambition had fully replaced everything else. There had been something real in him then, she believed. She had not invented it. She was not naive enough to have spent 7 years with a complete fiction. There had been moments, early ones, when he had been present with her in a way that was genuine. When he had laughed at something she said without calculating whether it was the right response. When he had reached for her hand without any agenda attached to the gesture. Those moments had become less frequent and then rare and then absent, and she had spent years trying to understand why, and then trying to accept that she could not understand why, and then finally understanding that the why was less important than the what. And the what was that the man she had married had decided that the architecture of getting ahead mattered more than the architecture of being someone worth the distance. She hoped he found his way to something better. She genuinely did. Not for his sake in any active way, not in a way that required her attention or her energy, but in the passive and quiet way that you can hope for the well-being of something that is no longer part of your life. You can wish it well from a great distance without carrying it with you. She turned off the highway onto the ranch road, and the familiar sound of gravel under the tires settled something in her chest, the way it always did. The second grant cycle launched 8 months after the first. 91 applications, 22 awards. The foundation had grown faster than any of them had projected, and Emily had hired 3 additional staff members and brought in 2 part-time consultants to manage the increased volume without sacrificing the quality of attention she insisted on for every application. She had also launched the mentorship program, pairing each grant recipient with a professional in their field for a 12-month structured relationship, and the early results were generating the kind of data that made funders pay attention. A national foundation reached out about a co-funding partnership. Emily negotiated the terms herself with Conrad's counterpart on the nonprofit side, and she walked into that negotiation with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, and walked out with an agreement that gave the Sterling Foundation full programmatic autonomy while accessing an additional $8 million in grant capital. William heard about the negotiation outcome from his own financial team before Emily mentioned it. He called her that evening. "I heard you took the National Foundation for everything they were prepared to offer," he said. "I took what the women we serve needed," she said. "The amount they were prepared to offer happened to match that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother would have loved watching you work." Emily sat with that for a moment. Her mother had been gone for 23 years. She still carried her in a specific way, not with grief anymore, but with a kind of living presence, a sense of being accompanied by someone who couldn't be seen. "She would have had opinions," Emily said. "She always did," William said. "You got that from her." "I thought I got it from you." "You got it from both of us," he said. "That's why it's formidable." 1 year after the courthouse, Emily stood at a podium in Denver at a regional philanthropy conference and delivered the keynote address to an audience of 400 people. She had not used a speechwriter. She had written it herself over 3 evenings at the kitchen table of the ranch house in Longhand on the same legal pads she used for her foundation notes. She had not shown it to anyone before she delivered it. She spoke for 22 minutes. She talked about what it means to build something quietly. She talked about the specific courage required to live without visible armor in a world that consistently mistakes vulnerability for weakness. She talked about the women the foundation served not as statistics or case studies, but as individuals. Carol in Colorado, the catering entrepreneur in Casper, the nursing student in Laramie, because she believed that the most important thing you can do for a person who has been rendered invisible by circumstance is to say their name out loud in a room full of people who have the power to help. She did not talk about Ethan. She did not talk about the courtroom. She did not talk about the divorce. Those things had happened, and they had mattered, and they had shaped the path that led her to that podium, but they were not the story she was there to tell. The story she was there to tell was about what comes after, about the part that doesn't make the headlines, the quiet, unglamorous daily work of rebuilding something that was always there underneath the damage, something that no one and nothing can actually take from you because it belongs to a part of you that exists below the reach of courtrooms and legal documents and other people's ambitions. The audience was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then they stood up. She stood at the podium and received it without performing anything. No false modesty, no overwhelming emotion. She simply stood and let it land and felt beneath the sound of it the specific stillness of a woman who has found her way back to the person she was always meant to be. After the conference at the reception, a young woman approached her, 27, maybe 28, with the careful composure of someone holding something difficult together with both hands. She introduced herself as Maya. She said she was in the middle of a divorce. She said she had 2 children and no savings in her name, and a lawyer she couldn't really afford, and she had come to the conference because she had read about the foundation, and she didn't know what else to do. Emily looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Come sit with me." They found 2 chairs at the edge of the room away from the noise, and Emily listened to Maya's story the same way she had listened to Carol's, completely without interruption, without the impatience of a person who has somewhere more important to be. Because she didn't. There was nowhere more important than this. There never had been. When Maya finished, she looked at Emily with the specific expression of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing and has been given for the first time a place to set it down. "I don't know why I thought you'd understand," she said. "You seem like you have everything figured out." Emily shook her head. "A year and a half ago, I walked out of a Dallas courtroom with nothing except debt and a father who was there when I needed him." She paused. "I didn't have anything figured out. I just had one next step. That's all you need." Maya looked at her. "What was your one next step?" "Going home," Emily said, simply, without drama. Because that was what it had been, the most ordinary and most necessary thing. Going back to the place that had always been hers and letting herself be held by it until she remembered what she was capable of. She connected Maya with Diane before the evening was over. Diane, who had become not just a program coordinator, but a genuinely trusted colleague, handled the initial intake with the same care she brought to everything. And 3 weeks later, Maya was connected with legal resources and a mentor and a grant application that was in Emily's assessment when she reviewed it, one of the strongest first-cycle applications they had received. Emily approved it personally. She drove back to Wyoming the following morning. The 2-lane highway, the gravel road, the sound of the land that had always known her name. William was in the kitchen when she arrived, reading the morning paper with his coffee, and he looked up when she came in and said simply, "Good trip." "Yes," she said. She set her bag down and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him at the table where she had eaten 10,000 meals since childhood, and she looked at her father. This man who had raised her and watched over her and waited with a patience that had outlasted everything that had tried to diminish her, and she felt the full weight of what she had been given. Not the money, not the foundation, not the resources or the safety net or the legal architecture that had protected her when she had not even known she needed protecting. The unconditional, unannounced, steady, and infinite fact of being loved by someone who saw you completely and chose you anyway. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her over the top of his paper. He understood what she was thanking him for. It wasn't the foundation, or the trust, or the courthouse. It was all of it, the whole of it, the 50-year commitment of a man who had decided long before she was old enough to understand it that she was worth everything he had. "You don't have to thank me for that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He folded his paper. He set it down. He picked up his coffee cup and held it with both hands the way he always did, and he looked at his daughter across the table, and he said nothing more because nothing more was needed. Outside, the Wyoming morning was doing what Wyoming mornings do, which is to arrive with a clarity and a scale that reminds you how large the world is and how much of it remains possible. Emily sat with her coffee, and she felt that possibility not as pressure, but as space. Open, undemanding, entirely hers. She had not won because Ethan lost. She had not arrived here because of what had been done to her. She had arrived here because of what she had refused to let it take. The part of her that had remained whole through 7 years of diminishment, the part that had kept volunteering on Saturdays and driving the cracked bumper SUV and sending handwritten cards to people she barely knew, that part had simply been waiting for the room to open up. And when it finally did, she had walked through it without looking back. The most expensive mistake a person can make is to look at something rare and call it ordinary. Ethan Carter had made that mistake. He had paid for it with everything. And Emily Sterling had walked out of the wreckage of his calculation and into the fullness of her own life, carrying nothing that wasn't hers and leaving nothing behind that she needed. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to become who they already are. Emily Sterling had simply come home.